You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, this is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I'm here with your weekly SLA Insight. I have up on the screen a figure that outlines the basic processes in acquisition. We're going to start looking at the mental processes that are involved in producing language output. If you look at this outline, this figure that I have up, or if you're just listening, I'll try to describe it to you. The process starts with input, and I've spent probably 20 episodes up to this point looking at input because it is so important. But then if we move on from input, we go to intake, and this is the small subset of input that is involved in acquisition. You can't attend to or process every single piece in the input that you're receiving. So the smaller amount that you actually take into your mental developing system is called intake. And the process, getting it from input to intake, is what's known as input processing. Well, then from intake, we go into the developing system. And this is really internal in the brain, something we can't directly observe. But when we go from intake to the developing system, we have accommodation or restructuring of your mental understanding of the language. And this is where the real acquisition comes in, where it becomes part of your mental structure. Well, we're now looking at output, and this is the last step in the process here. And this is to get to output. There are three processes that we need to use to get the output out of the developing system. And these are access, monitoring, and production strategies. And for today, I'm just going to look at access, one of the important mental processes that are involved in producing output. You need to be able to access in your memory, in your developing system, in that otherwise black box that we can't directly observe, the language pieces that you have actually learned and committed to memory. And so with that, we're going to look more specifically at access, what it is, how it works, and then what we can do to promote access and make access a little bit easier for students of language who are learning languages. So to start out with, access, a formal definition is that access is the process of connecting words and expressions to their meanings. In layman's terms, it's getting that word or form out of your memory to be able to use it in whatever conversation or writing that you're doing. Because again, with output, we're doing production. We are writing or we are speaking the language. So in the process of output, you have a meaning that you want to convey to your interlocutor, and you need to connect it with the words or expressions that are appropriate for the language, for the situation. And the first step in doing that is access, getting it out of your memory bank and into the conversation. Now, a learner can only access what he or she has learned or internalized. And that goes back to the figure that I introduced the section with. You have to have gotten input, intake, developed it into your system, your language memory system. Only then can you produce output. So output and access as part of output is very much dependent on input. It's very much dependent on acquisition. You cannot produce, you cannot speak or write what you have not been introduced to. You can't say something that you haven't already learned. Now, when we talk about access, you can access two different types of language knowledge. In episodes 2 through 6 of SLA Insights, I talked a little bit about implicit language knowledge and explicit language knowledge. Implicit knowledge is unconscious and intuitive knowledge that sometimes you don't even know what you know, but it's there. Explicit knowledge of the language is conscious, it's formalized, it's the rules, it's the paradigms, and some of the vocabulary as well. So a learner can produce output by accessing either one or both types of language knowledge. If they access the implicit language knowledge, their production is going to be faster and more accurate than if they access their explicit language knowledge. But sometimes we do need to access that explicit knowledge, the paradigm, the rule, even in English or your native language. Sometimes you need to go back and say, okay, oh yeah, this is lay, not lie, or whatever it is. Now, SLA researchers will typically see one of two scenarios depending on the goal of producing output in terms of access. If the goal is communicating meaning, that is, the goal is fluency, getting the meaning out there, getting it out there in a timely manner, so you can stay in the conversation, then you're more likely to access and use implicit, that unconscious, intuitive language knowledge. However, if the goal is accuracy or correctness in production, and time is not as much a factor, then the person producing the language is more likely to use explicit language knowledge to fill in the gaps that the implicit knowledge may or may not have, to compensate for any lack in the implicit language knowledge. So again, we're talking access, we're talking about how we get this memory of the language out of us, how we access that memory. Another way of thinking about access is, again, retrieving this memory from long-term storage or long-term memory. So imagine the form or the vocabulary item that you're trying to access, that you want to use to produce whatever output it is you're going to do. Imagine that that is a dot in the middle of many, many memories stored in your brain. Like your brain is this circle, and in that circle, there's this dot that represents the vocabulary item, the grammatical form that you need to access to produce whatever utterance you're trying to do. Now, imagine also that you've only learned that item one time. You've only been exposed to it one time, or in one way, perhaps explicitly only or implicitly only, or only in one context, one single sentence, one single story you have access to, or one mode. Only in reading have you encountered that word or that item. That means you only have one path, or in psychology terms, one memory trace leading to that memory. So you've got the circle, you've got the dot somewhere in the middle, and you've only got one path leading to that memory. That means you've only got one way to get there. You have one access to that particular memory. Now imagine instead if you have many paths, more paths to that memory through multiple exposures, through multiple contexts, perhaps different stories, different texts you've encountered this word, multiple modes, both reading and listening, you've encountered this. The more exposures and the greater variety of exposures will lead to more paths or more memory traces to that particular memory. And that way, if one path is blocked, for example, you're under stress trying to think on your feet and get that utterance out, and so you've got more stress and it somehow blocks some of those paths, then you have several other paths and can still access the memory. If you can't get it this way, you maybe can get it from this way. So up to this point then, I've been talking in a lot of theoretical terms, how our brains work, how we access this language memory that we have, multiple memory traces, and so on. But there is a payoff here. There's an action point for teachers and even for students, if you're listening. Create opportunities to develop multiple exposures in multiple contexts to increase the likelihood of students acquiring and accessing the language that they are studying. And this really all goes back to input. More input, more types of input, more forms of input, so you can create those multiple memory traces to make access faster, more likely, more accurate. And so if you've got the opportunity, don't just look at the form or the vocabulary item one time. Look at it multiple times in multiple contexts. Read it, speak it, listen to it. The more exposures, the better, and the greater variety of exposures will also improve the chances of accessing that memory to be able to use the form that you have learned. So, by way of review here, access is the process of connecting words and expressions to their meaning. In other words, grabbing that memory out of long-term storage, out of the developing language system to be able to use it. It's the first of 3 mental processes that are involved in producing output. And you have to remember, because you have to remember the words you want to use, and you need to be able to connect them with the meanings you want to convey. So next week, then, I'm going to look at the last 2 mental processes involved in language production or output, and that is monitoring and production strategies. So I hope you can join me, and in the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.